Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing inheritance within CSS. So in this example here, all we have is a main tag, and inside of the main tag we have two tags, an h1 with the text of inheritance, and a button with the text of click me. And then in our styles.css, we have one rule set. This rule set is on the main selector, and we set two declarations. First, the color of red, and the border of 2 pixels solid black. And now if you look at the output, you can see the h1 is being colored red, and then we have this black border that's around the entire main tag, and the button looks just like the default button. Nothing has happened on it. So what's really happening here? Why is the h1 red when it's not even mentioned in the selector? And why is it not getting the border? If it's getting the color, why is it not getting the border? Why is it not just getting all of the values from this rule set or none of them? And if the h1 is being colored red, why is the button not being colored red too? And the answer to all of these questions lies in inheritance as well as the user agent style sheet set by the browser. So in CSS, every property is either an inherited property or a non-inherited property. And what this means is that inherited properties, if they have not been set by a style sheet, will just default to whatever the parent's value is. And because of this inheritance, it will keep going up the tree. So it will be set to the parent's value, but if that parent doesn't have a value, it will set it to the grandparent's value, and so on and so forth until it finds a value that has actually been set. On the other hand, a non-inherited property will only look at the element itself. It will not look up the parent tree to see if another element has set that property. So in this case, color is an inherited property. Border, on the other hand, is not an inherited property. So this is why the h1 is getting the color of red, but it's not getting the border of 2 pixels solid black. And most of the time, this ends up working exactly how we would expect it to, and we don't need to worry about it. Usually, we wouldn't want a border to inherit. That would be strange if setting a border on a parent set borders on all of the children. But color, for instance, we probably do want that to be inheriting most of the time, so it makes sense for that to be inherited. However, this doesn't answer the question of the button. Why is the button not red? Because color is an inherited property, so why is it not inheriting it? And to answer this question, let's move over to the Chrome Inspector and take a look at this button. So if we open up the body, and then we open up the main tag, we can see the button here. And if we click on it, we can see all of the styles being applied to it. And we haven't set any styles, but we have the user agent style sheet, so the browser defaults, and it's setting a ton of different values. One of the properties it sets is color, and it sets this to the value of a variable internal light dark, which is a Chrome specific variable that will end up being black in this case. So even though color is an inherited property, the button is not inheriting because there is a style sheet that is setting the color. And if we scroll all the way down, you can see all of the inherited values, and it is inheriting the color of red. It's just crossed out because of the fact that it is being overridden by the user agent style sheet. And we can also see the border value here, but it is grayed out, implying that this is not an inherited property by default, so that border is not being used. All this said, within CSS, we can actually change this behavior. So for example, I can come down here and add a button rule set, and we will set this to be color of inherit. So we can set the inherit value on any property in CSS, and this says just go and inherit from my parent even if I'm not an inherited property. And in the case of the color on the button, this is an inherited property by default, but what we can do by setting this to color inherit is we are overriding the user agent style sheet because our color value has a higher level of precedence within the cascade because it's part of the author style sheet. So we end up getting this color inherit, which overrides the color set by the browser, and we end up with red text for the button. And we can even set this inherit value on properties that are not inherited by default. So for example, I could say border inherit, and what this will do is it will get the 2 pixel black border that came from its parent, the main tag, even though that was not an inherited property by default. But for now, I will remove this border and just leave it with color of inherit. Now, in addition to the inherit value that we can set on any property, there are a few other values that work the same way. So for example, I could set this to initial. And what initial says is, don't worry about the user agent style sheet, and don't worry about inheritance. Just go look at the actual spec for CSS and do whatever that says. In this case, buttons in the spec just have a black text, so initial is black text. And next we also have the unset value. And what unset says is if this is an inherited property by default, just inherit. And if it's not an inherited property by default, then go to the initial value from the spec. And the unset value is very useful for undoing what is in the user agent style sheet. So for example, I can say border unset, and this will get rid of the border from the user agent style sheet. And because border is not an inherited property, it will go all the way back to the initial value from the CSS spec, which in this case is to have no border. And finally, there's one more value that we can set anywhere in CSS, and that is going to be revert. And what revert says is just look at the style sheet above me in the cascade. So for example, if we say border revert, since this is the author style sheet, it's going to go back to the user style sheet and say, is there a property border for button in the user style sheet? And if there's not, then it will cascade further to the user agent style sheet, which is why in this case, this is reverting back to the border that was set by the user agent style sheet for the button. And lastly, I wanted to show one property that we can use like these values and that we can use it for any element. So on the button, I can use the all property. And what this says is look at every single property and set all of them to this value. So for example, I can set all of them to unset. And now you can see we have lost all of the user agent style sheet properties except for border, because border we have reverted, which is saying border use the user agent style sheet, but everything else we've unset, which is setting the button back to sort of the defaults as if there was no user agent style sheet. And if I got rid of this border revert, we can see the button is now simply inheriting the color from main, and then all of the other properties just look like standard text, because what we are used to for buttons is actually just from the user agent style sheet. It's not specified in the CSS spec. And again, we can use all for all of these different values. So I could set all of the values to inherit, for example. And now you'll see we are inheriting the border from main because border is one of the properties within all, and color is still unset, but that is also reverting back to the main color of red. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video on inheritance in CSS. Most of the time, we don't need to worry too much about inheritance. It will sort of work how we expect it to, but sometimes you end up in a scenario where something's not looking how you expect it to, and this can come down to the user agent style sheet overriding the values that you thought would be inherited, or it can come down to a property that you thought was an inherited property not being an inherited property. So it's good to know how these rules work. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.